Hi, it's Karen, and I'm at the Cool Tool Studio today to demonstrate how to do a cloisonné wire inlay. Some of you might be familiar with cloisonné wire from enameling, but I'm going to be using it today in a marriage of metals process. For cloisonné wire inlay, you start with sheet metal and cut lines into the sheet and then slide the cloisonné wire in. It's soldered in place, creating a beautiful linear pattern. I have some samples here of cloisonné wire inlay, and here's the project that we're going to be doing today. Before I dive right in, let's take a look at what you're going to need for this project. Today, I'm going to be using a jeweler's saw frame, a circle template, a file, a flash shiner, some cloisonné wire, and wire cutters. I'm going to be using 18 gauge copper, but you could use 18 gauge brass if you'd like. I'm also going to be working with sandpaper, starting at 240 and working my way all the way down to 800. A dust mask and some Baldwin's patina. I've got flux and a flex brush, some cut lube, some easy and medium solder. I have a Scribe, 2/0 and 6/0 saw blades, a 6-inch ruler, a split mandrel, and a permanent marker. I also have an annealing pan with a flat soldering brick. I'm also going to be using tweezers, a solder pick, and a big shot torch. I'm going to be starting this project by cutting the outside edge of my shape. And I'm working with a circle, so I'm just going to use a permanent marker to mark the line that I will be cutting around. And at this point in the project, it doesn't matter what thickness of blade you work with. I'm going to be using a 2/0 because that's what I prefer when cutting 18 gauge metal, but you can use a slightly thicker blade if you'd like. I'm going to insert my blade into the jeweler's saw frame with the teeth pointing down and out. And I like to start with all 3 of the screws loose. And I'm going to begin by placing my blade into the top. And I'm not pushing it at any point right now. I'm just going to kind of use my chest to help stabilize things. And then I'm going to slide at the back until the blade is just in reach of the bottom holding plate. And then I'm going to tighten the back of my frame. And then I'm going to apply tension to my blade. And this is important. If your blade isn't tight, then your cuts are going to wander and you're more likely to break more blades. So this is loose, tucking it in, and I'm just going to push forward. I've got my arm braced, and then I'm going to tighten this plate. And then when you take off the tension, there's nice tension behind your blade. So I'm going to start off by adding some cut lube, and this just helps you keep from snagging. And I'm going to begin my cut. And some things to keep in mind when you're cutting: you want to be centered in front of your work and have it at chest height. Try not to lean and work over your cuts. You want to be on something nice and flat, so a bench pin's perfect for this. And you want to be able to keep your cuts straight up and down. So I like to begin with just a very gentle, I'm not really putting pressure at this point, drag down. And that kind of gives you a little nook to tuck your blade into for the rest of the cut. So now I'm going to come into that. So again, try to keep your blade upright and make sure you're not leaning. And I'm going to be doing most of my turning with my cut hand. You might see me doing a little bit of rotating with the metal as well, but remember that you can't just twist your piece. You have to be moving while you're rotating or you'll break your blade. So I'm up to my circle edge now. I'm going to cut this line. And remember, your cuts don't have to be perfect. You can always come and clean things up with a file. You're just establishing the shape of the metal. I have my circle cut out, and at this point, you can do a little bit of filing to the edge if you'd like but you're gonna have to come back and clean it up later, so it doesn't have to be perfect at this point. When you're doing cloisonné wire inlay, you want to avoid cutting your shape into multiple pieces. So if you have lines that intersect or touch, you may have to plan for doing 2 or more rounds of soldering. And I have a little drawing here to illustrate my point. If I were to just follow this line and cut all of these strips in one go, I would be left with separate little individual pieces, and then it would be really hard to get them all assembled and have enough tension when I'm soldering. So I plan to do 2 rounds of soldering, the first indicated by the pen marks here. And I'm going to go in and make these cuts with my saw frame, insert the cloisonné wire into them, and solder them in place. Then I'm going to come back and do a second round where I'm going to cut on the pencil lines, and then I'm going to solder those wires in place. In doing so will help keep things clean and crisp. If you have a design where your lines aren't intersecting and touching, you don't have to worry about that, and you can just do it all in one go. So I have my design transferred onto my metal here, and before I dive right into my cutting, I'm going to take a moment and save myself a lot of trouble later by going over the lines that I'm not cutting and soldering this round with the Scribe. Since my lines are going to disappear when I pickle and solder the first round of cuts, I'm going to give myself a Scribe line that I can follow with a Sharpie and use as a guide for my second round of cuts. So I'm just marking the lines that I won't be cutting this round. That way I have a guide when I go to actually cut them the second go through. So I have my lines scribed on, and if you can see that really well and know not to cut those, that's fine and dandy, but I'm going to give myself a little extra reminder not to cut those lines and go over them with a Sharpie. Sometimes you just get in the groove and you might accidentally cut those, and then you'd have to start over. I also accidentally scribed a little too far, but that's okay. I'll know when I'm making that cut to end at the other one. So now that I've got my plan and I'm ready to make my cuts, I'm going to put my safety glasses on. I forgot to mention these earlier because it's such a habit, but you do want to be wearing eye protection. So I swapped out my blade for a 6/0 blade, and I'm moving to such a thin blade because the thinness of the blade matches that of the cloisonné wire. And when you're soldering, you want a really tight fit. So I'm going to be working with a 6/0 blade. And I'll start with this guy here. And again, I'm just going to start with a downstroke before leveling out and following that line into the middle. And when you're sawing, sometimes it's helpful, some benches have little arm rests that come out. Try to make sure that you're not pulling down on your bracing hand. You should just be keeping your piece down, but not white knuckling it or forcing anything. So there's one cut. Now I'm going to come over to the other side, do this one. And I'm just going to keep cutting on these lines, and then we'll be at the point where we're ready to add the cloisonné wires. So I have all my lines cut for the first round of soldering, and I'm ready to insert my cloisonné wire. So you should be able to slide the wire in, and again, we used a 6/0 blade, so it would be a nice tight fit. So when you're first getting it started, you might have to do a little wiggling, but then it should slide right in. And then I'm going to use some wire cutters to trim off the extra there. And it's okay if there's a little tab hanging off. Once it's soldered, you can file that away. So the fit should be tight enough that you can move it around and it won't fall out. So I'm going to slide wire into all of these cuts that I had previously made, and then we'll be ready to solder them in place. So I have my cloisonné wires in place, and I'm going to be flexing both sides of my piece because I want the solder to flow on both sides. And then once you get them flexed, go ahead and re-nudge your lines and make sure that in brushing the flex on, you didn't dislocate the wires at all. This guy, I can tell I tapped out a little bit. So I'm going to put them on my flat brick, and we're working on a flat solid brick so our wires aren't going to be tempted to fall back or slide on us at all when the metal around it is annealed. It's going to loosen a little bit. So you want to make sure it's on a nice flat surface. And our wires will stay put. So I put my piece down with the scribe lines on the other side. I did that because I'm going to be laying solder on this side, and if my solder runs any, I still want to be able to see those other cut lines clearly. So I'm going to give my piece a preliminary heating to activate the flux, and that's going to make it clear and sticky. And I like doing that because if you were to lay your flux, lay your solder, and then heat, it's going to bubble a little bit, and that might kind of scoot the solder around. So I'm going to heat my piece some, and then place my solder, and then reheat to actually solder my piece. So I've got a big shot torch here, and don't need much heat at all. I'm just warming up flux. And I can actually tell already from the way that things are darkening around my flux that it looks like I could use a little more flux up here. I didn't quite get it on both sides of the line. And see how it's moving? If your solder was down at this point, it'd be slipping and sliding around on you. All right. So now, since I have 2 rounds of soldering, I'm going to be placing medium solder, and these pre-cut chips that Cool Tools sells are super convenient for this. And your piece is going to drink up quite a bit of solder, and you want to make sure that there's enough for it to go on through to the other side as well. So I'm using quite a bit of solder for this project. So I'm just going to follow my lines with solder. And then once I have those all in place, we'll catch back up and we'll actually solder them in place. So I have all my solder placed and I'm ready to go. And I'm going to start with a very gentle flame, kind of from far away, and then work my way in and turn up the heat as needed, because I'm, again, trying to keep my solder where it is. A little more gas. And I'm just kind of working in a circular motion to try to heat this piece as a whole. Since the cloisonné wires are so thin and in very close contact with the copper around it, they're going to gain heat from the surrounding metal. So I'm not going to focus on those wires, because if I did, I might end up melting them. So it looks like my solder is going to stay put. I'm going to bring on a little more heat. And you're starting to go there. And I'm going to keep working until I see it flash at all the seams. Alright, all of my solder is flowed. So I'm going to allow this to cool because there's flux on the other side. It might stick to the brick while it's hot. And then I'm going to put it in the pickle to clean it up. When I say pickle your piece, I'm referring to cleaning your piece after soldering. And we sell something called silver prep that you combine with water and heat in something like a crock pot. And then you soak your piece in the pickle. That cleans away any excess flux and brings the metal back to a bright, clean surface. While that piece is pickling, we're going to move along with another piece that I've already got cleaned up. And here's the side that had the solder on it. And then here's the side that still has the scribe lines on it that you can follow. And at this point you can choose to either go over those with Sharpie, or you can just cut on the scribe lines if you can see them well enough. And just like the first round through, I'm going to be cutting the lines with a 6/0 saw blade and inserting the cloisonné wire. And then I'm going to be soldering it with easy solder this round. So I have my cloisonné wires in place, and I've laid down some flux just like before, and I'm going to give my piece a preheat before laying down easy solder this time. And I'm using easy solder this time, that way my previous seams won't flow and my piece won't fall apart on me. So I'm just looking for this to get kind of transparent. Now I'm going to lay down my easy solder, just like I did the first time. And there we go. So all my solder flashed, and I'm going to pickle it to clean it up. So here's my piece after it came out of the pickle, and it's got both rounds of soldering done. So now my lines are in, and I'm going to file away the extra on the edges there, and then take some time to knock down any of the higher lumps of solder with a file before I move on to cleaning up the surface with a split mandrel. I'm just taking down this extra cloisonné wire, and if there's any extra solder on the sides, you'll want to remove that now as well. So my sides are cleaned up, and now I don't have too much work to do with the file. I'm just going to run it over and see if it's taking down some solder and clean up the high points. Flip it over. I've got some higher blobs there that I'm going to take down. But the split mandrel is really going to do most of the work for us today. So I'm going to move on to putting 240 paper into my split mandrel. So I just like to slide it in and then gently push down and start the roll and let it feed in. So as a side note, I have my dust mask on. You're going to be kicking up quite a bit of particulates, and you want to make sure you're not breathing that in. And see how quickly you're taking down the solder? I'm going to keep going with the 240 until a majority of the solder is gone, and then I'm going to work my way down to clean up the surface. So I spent some time with the 240 paper on the split mandrel, and there's still a few pieces of stray solder, but for the most part it's looking cleaned up, so I'm going to move on to the 320 paper to start to clean things up and even them out. And then once the 320 looks good, I'm just going to work my way down to 800, and at that point I'll be brightening things up and bringing them to a shine. So I just wrapped up with my 800 paper. Let's take a closer look. So I still have some directional lines from my 800 paper, so I'm going to use a flash shiner in a circular motion to buff those out, the green, and then move to the white to really bring it up to a shine. So the flash shiner brings it to a really nice finish, and my piece is done. My silver wire transitions nicely into my copper, and I don't have any gaps in my seam. I love the way that the silver lines look next to the copper, but if you want to add a little extra contrast, you can use Baldwin's patina, and that will darken the copper but leave the silver nice and bright. You can either drill a hole in these pieces and hang them as pendants, or you can tab or bezel set them into a more complex piece of jewelry. I wouldn't recommend reheating these pieces to solder anything onto them though. I hope you've enjoyed this video on cloisonné wire inlay and that you feel like you can give Marriage of Metals a go. Thanks for watching.
Visit our Learning Center at cooltools.us for more cool jewelry making videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to sign up for our email list to be the first to hear about new videos, new products, and other cool stuff from Cool Tools.